Good morning and welcome to the daily chapter reading of It's Your Loss. Living with grief is hard. We hope this book will help. If you really feel unable to ask for help and have an overwhelming to-do list, schedule in short, manageable periods of doing stuff time and follow them up with some kind of luxurious treat time to make everything feel better. Can you help me remember that song we used to love dancing to? Or it could be, please may I have my favorite jacket back? Once you get more comfortable asking for small things, the big things will get easier. And even better when you don't have to ask anybody and you just go out and get it yourself. Done. Dr. Sheetal says, loss is a journey. We will all navigate this road differently. This journey is not linear and you will struggle to piece together a trajectory on day one which will look the same at the end. Some are on this journey for a long time, and many take some time to understand what they are looking for. For others, their vision of grief ending may be that they are able to carry on with life with an acceptance that the loss has occurred and being okay with that. The circumstances of the loss will play a role too. Could I have done more to help? Did I have a hand in this eventuality? If only I was there. I should have spent more time with them. Now they will never know how much I loved them. These are all questions that are normal, valid, and important to work through and reframe. It can be easy to internalize other people's expectations, especially when you are feeling vulnerable or unsure of yourself, and you can feel a sense of pressure, weakness, or even defectiveness for still going through inner turmoil after a certain amount of time has passed. Why can't I deal with it but others can? But if everyone else is hiding their sadness too, we can't truly know how they really are coping, can we? This is why it's so important to speak and be open when you're ready, not only to show vulnerability to your friends and teach yourself that it's okay, but also to change the world's perspective on how it makes people feel they should be coping. The importance of talking. If we acknowledge our anxieties and losses, growth and resilience will be more significant. As therapists, we know that talking and sharing can really help. We witness this all the time. After most first sessions, I hear from my clients how much easier it was to talk than they expected and also how cathartic it was. Generally, people come to see us because there has been a realization that in whatever way they were coping up until now, it is clearly no longer working for them. Maybe that process has served its purpose and you were ready to admit that. A couple of things to consider. What would I do if it was my best friend, sister, partner? Would I want them to feel that they could come to me no matter what? Something I often ask my clients is, how do you want to feel, be, or cope with this stuff down the line? And how do we work towards that together? I spent most of the spring after the birth of my son in bed. I was recovering from postpartum psychosis and a 2-week stay in a psychiatric facility. By the time I was released, I felt like I'd been blown apart and I was no longer sure of who I was. I fell into a deep depression. It was as though someone had tied an anchor to my body and there was only darkness. My son was 6 months old, but I couldn't stand to touch him. Somewhere I knew that I wasn't being a good mother, but I couldn't begin to feel anything about it. We moved into a flat with windows facing the south sun, and my husband bought a pink rug and yellow cushions as though the brightness could find a way within. My memory of that spring is sitting in the sunshine and only feeling an aching pain, as though my body no longer wanted me to inhabit it. And all I could do was to try to keep going and hope that one day the light would come in. Everyone told me that it would, and I tried to believe them even though I couldn't imagine it. But it did, slowly, glimmers at first and then longer moments. The world became clearer, the light brighter, and I could touch my son without flinching. I try not to mourn those days, to think about what was lost. Instead, I think about how desperately I wished to get better and how grateful I am that I found my way back. The unmistakable whiff of guilt, anger, anxiety, and the rest. Why, when you're going through a loss, does everything else feel so bloody hard? A two-person romp through all the other complicated emotion stuff a loss can throw up. Emma on the unmistakable whiff of guilt, anger, anxiety, and the rest. Notes from the guilty, anxious one. Experiencing loss is rarely just experiencing loss. You know when you try to get a clothes hanger out of a bag of the other clothes hangers? However hard you try, you never just get one. You'll probably end up angry and sweating and cursing the person who made clothes hangers a thing. And loss is the same. Losing something or somebody might happen as an event all on its own, but it'll almost always bring with it a whole bunch of emotional things you weren't expecting. If you're built like me and like to keep a lid on the old emotional box where possible, that can be a hideously unwelcome discovery. Or if, like me, you're hell-bent on not looking at the loss in question, it can become a hideously effective coping mechanism you'll spend many years later unpicking. Of course, it all starts way before you actually go through a loss. Often, these things are so baked into who we are, we don't even know they're there. If somebody asked you what kind of person you are, what would you say? Confident, needy, sad, anxious, number one, wham, fam. Are you prone to bouts of depression? Do you have an online shopping habit that you just won't quit? Maybe you have OCD or can't stop buying cats. Maybe you're hyper-organized and have a spreadsheet for everything. A work-obsessed power player who's in the office at 5 a.m. and still there at midnight. You might be a finger picker or a lip biter, a serial partier or an hermetic recluse. It's worth having a think about because whoever you were before the loss lorry hit you is going to have some bearing on how you deal with that loss. We are creatures of habit. Our brains don't like change. So when we're in shock after any kind of loss, those brains are going to reach for the nearest thing that feels familiar and helpful, even if that thing is very much not helpful long term. So the online shopper funnels deeper and deeper into ordering stuff, surely the ultimate distraction. The workaholic takes on every project in sight and moves a bed into the office. The finger picker's thumbs are red, raw, and bleeding. We all have unhelpful emotional behaviors, crutches, and coping mechanisms. They are a symptom of living in the world and finding ways to navigate adversity without falling apart. And you bitch a sweet bippy that when you're at your most vulnerable is when they'll start to really creep in. So while your brain's busy dealing with the big disaster, things you might usually be vigilant against, like stress, debt, addiction, unhealthy relationships, or lack of self-care, are free to romp all over your emotional garden unchecked. Because when you're bereft, when you're focused on a terrible thing, your defenses are down. Your energy is low, your resistance is weak, and your lovely brain, which just wants to protect you, calls in reinforcements from the last time you felt like this. Only those things aren't always the best things for you. So you're sad. But you can't focus on the sad because your brain's all like, look at this terrible memory from 10 years ago, or remember when you fit into those jeans, or I wonder what your awful ex is doing with their new partner on Instagram, or you know what's fun? Drinking. You see where this is going? None of those have anything to do with your loss, and you might not even feel like they're connected when they come up, but they're all your brain's roundabout way of helping out with the threat, your loss, by switching your attention away from it and onto something else. Of course, it rarely works. You can't just switch off your emotions about one thing. Wouldn't it be easier if we could? A selective emotional fuse board where we could just pop the switches off when we need to. When we decide to switch off the bit that deals with the loss experience, we trip the system, everything goes dark, and we generally stop processing everything at all. And then you find yourself a decade later unable to sit still by yourself for 5 minutes because the bad thoughts come in. Just me? Your way of avoiding might look different to mine, but ultimately not dealing with the big thing can be really damaging, and it doesn't help in the long term unless you love feeling on edge for the rest of eternity. For quiet people like me, it's about finding ways to be firm but kind to yourself through the loss, build out the space and time and structures to focus on it, understand it, and eventually work through it. Sounds good, right? The best at being bad. I'm the master of guilt. If turning things which I have no control over into something that's all my fault were an Olympic sport, I'd win all the gold medals. They'd have to invent a bigger gold medal just for me. Even things that are done to me will turn out in my head to be my fault. So, when I lost my mom, there was a whole lot of guilt thrown into the mix that continued long into my grieving process. And I'm here to tell you that if I, the guilt, anxiety, and not looking after yourself sensei, can learn to look objectively at these things, it's highly unlikely that you can find a way to do it too. We can't give you a treasure map to emotional freedom. Let's talk learned coping mechanisms. I'd been fearing losing my mom since I was little. As she pulled away from dropping me off at my dad's house, I'd start praying she wouldn't die in a car crash on the way home, that sort of thing. In retrospect, after many years of therapy, I can see that in itself was an early symptom of anxiety, my brain's little way of exerting control and protecting me against nasty surprises. And if you too have been worrying about something happening that actually does then happen, you'll know it means that you feel that you've been proven right. Those years of being afraid and all that secret worrying have borne fruit, and you were correct to have been preparing yourself for it. For me, these weren't articulated thoughts as much as they were just a base level understanding of how the world worked. Fear keeps you safe. Fear is your friend. Always listen to fear. And then 2 things happened. First, I couldn't think about the fact that she was gone. And it was such an overwhelmingly huge thing in such a young life that my brain had to call in the big guns to stop me focusing on it. Enter the second thing, anxiety. Chest clamping, nerve shaking, insomnia-inducing anxiety. Now I knew fear protected me. I could be fearful about everything. I believed I needed to keep everybody around me happy or they'd leave me. So I'd run myself ragged, going out, having dinners, attending work parties and birthdays, staying up late talking with friends, and bending over backwards to keep a terrible relationship going. I was constantly thinking about who I thought other people needed me to be rather than what I could do for myself. I tried to cut out social events where people might ask about it, but couldn't spend time on my own. I tried to sit still, but fidgeted constantly. I tried to distract myself and would do things in a frenzy, like throwing out all my clothes or organizing the spice cupboard. I'd make myself comfort food, then just sit and look at it. I'd have coffee for breakfast and an apple for dinner. I'd be on my phone, watching TV, shopping, doing, always on. It was anything to keep my mind active. Anything I could worry about became a monolith on my horizon, and the best worry of all was that I was not good enough. That I was bad. If I believed that things were my fault, I could chastise myself. I could believe that improving myself would make me feel better. It's a form of mental self-harm that I indulged in with wild abandon. It's a form. Does any of it sound familiar? This is all the hairy drain sludge that came out of the plug hole of my loss, but yours could look completely different. I know people who feel acute rage, people who need to create, people who need to give back, Not all side effects of loss are terrible, but it helps to be able to spot the ones that are, because when they're recurring behaviors, you can start to watch out for the early warning signs. Guilt feels like a good starting point because for lots of us it forms part of our journey through loss, and indeed is one of the famous 7 stages of grief, the others being shock and denial, pain and guilt, anger and bargaining, depression, reflection and loneliness, the upward turn and acceptance. In my case, guilt pops up a lot because believing everything's all my fault gives me something to feel anxious about, and this is my ultimate way of not dealing with things. I'll give you an example that looks at a loss that isn't death, but estrangement. I'm estranged from my stepdad for very valid reasons, backed up by my own experiences and other people's. And yet still, there's a little taparoo at my emotional windows, and it's old man guilt at the door, here to tell me that I've got it all wrong, that I'm overreacting, that he is old now and might be sad inside, and that I'm hurting him by not being present. Luckily, I have a very sensible therapist to remind me what purpose that guilt serves: to make me feel bad, keep me in my well-worn emotional state, and stop me from changing and growing. Because movement into the unknown can feel more frightening than staying where we are, even if that place is terribly painful. But if you can work into understanding those feelings, that growth can gently plop you out into the world a happier, more robust version of yourself. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Often we have no control over when losses happen, or even what feels like a loss to us. A seemingly joyful occasion can leave us mourning the life and identity we feel is being taken away. So a prosperous retirement might end up feeling like loss of direction and purpose. A successful graduation means leaving your student life behind. In my own life, often when I've had positive milestones, they're followed by an acute sense of loss, a hollow where the build up to that milestone had been. And when that happens, when it feels like the world thinks you ought to be rejoicing, there's a special kind of loneliness tied up with it all. A sort of unnameable shame when you feel like your reaction to something is at odds with the way everybody else seems to feel about it. In fact, for people-pleasing folks, that can be a key thing. Feeling like your reaction to loss has anything to do with other people. When my mom died, I was at pains to make everything okay for everybody else, and if you're anything like me, you might feel the same. The desire to not be a burden, not be over sad, not attract too much attention, to make everything seem okay. It's a coping mechanism, and one that served me well enough for a while, in that I was able to function as a human being in the world. But of course, constantly pretending something isn't an issue takes a whole lot of energy. Worrying all the time will really take it out of you, and eventually you might just burn out and won't be able to function in the world as a human being. Once you know that your brain defaults to a certain reaction when there's something you need to deal with, though, you can try learning to do the opposite. To actively try to process and not rush yourself to do it. I talk about anxiety and fear as my example reactions because they're familiar to me, but yours might be anger or hyperactivity or feelings of depression or intricate kitchen filing systems. Maybe have a think about where your head goes when you get stressed. It's pretty uncomfortable, but like physical exercise, the only way to build mental strength and fortitude is to train yourself to be okay with that. It's easy to think of coping mechanisms as just the way you're built. They're so much part of who we are that questioning them can feel really threatening. Your brains developed them to protect you against the big bad world, like an emotional zorb as you tumble down the rocky hill of life. Take away the Zorb, and that tumble feels a lot more dangerous, much more naked, and probably quite frightening. But actually, although while standing at the top of the hill you'll imagine the cuts and grazes and the broken bones, what actually happens when you take away the Zorb is that you learn to run down the hill. You teach yourself where to confidently place each foot. You learn to trust yourself to get up when you fall. And you realize that if you do take a bad fall and break your face, it'll be okay because your face will heal and you might even get brand new veneers as a result. In this analogy, let's say veneers are shiny white pearls of knowing yourself a little bit better. Like training and definitely zorbing, sometimes it's best to engage the help of a professional so you don't fracture your leg the first time you try. For example, I got myself to the point that I couldn't think about my mom or look at photos without having some kind of panic attack. In fact, those panic attacks had started to creep into my everyday, so I found myself a therapist to talk to, and if things are tough for you, if you feel out of control or just feel a bit weird lots of the time, I can't recommend it enough. Find a therapist, find a group, find somebody outside of yourself who you can go to for level-headed intel when you need it. And if anxiety is your reaction of choice, try following an anxious thought to its absolute worst conclusion. Allow me to demonstrate with one of my own go-to wormholes. Emma, I don't want to take on this freelance job. Brain, but the client really wants you to. Emma, yeah, I guess so. Brain, and you don't want to let them down. Emma, no, you're right. Brain, because they've given you work in the past. Emma, Brain, and you don't want to seem ungrateful. Emma, no, that's true, I don't. Brain, you've taken quite a while to respond to their email. I bet they're really mad at you. Emma, oh no, do you think so? Brain, yeah, I bet they think you're really unprofessional. Emma, oh man, I'm just not sure I have the time. Brain, but you could make the time, you really need the money. Emma, Brain, what if no other work comes in for ages? Emma, I guess. Brain, you'll have to live off your tax money, and then you'll get done by HMRC and won't be able to pay your rent, and you'll have to move out, and your business will die, and your partner will leave you, and you'll never work again because the whole industry will know you failed. Yeah, my brain is a dick, but you can see that one little anxiety about whether to take on a little freelance job actually carries with it the much bigger fear of total loss of everything I own and love in the world. Rather than try to tamp down that initial spike of fear and tell ourselves we're being silly, how about knowing that if we allow the fear to take shape and follow the thought to the end of the road, it'll often turn out that we are giving a very small thing a large amount of projected meaning. When I first started seeing my therapist, hoping to be cured of anxiety, she told me that I might never be completely anxiety-free, but that with work, one day I could learn to view it as a slightly embarrassing old friend who I don't really need to have around anymore, and that's the hope I have for you and any unhelpful emotional coping mechanisms you might have too. That one day you'll see them not as a looming presence on your lost journey, but more like an overprotective, neurotic friend who you might wave to across the road and then wander down a side street so you don't have to say hello to. I know the first time I heard that, I inwardly scoffed and scuffed and thought, absolutely no way, mate. But in my case at least, my therapist was right. With time and effort and a bit of self-love, that emotional sludge that comes up with your loss can start to pare back. You may well discover the drain unblocker that is knowing it's okay to feel terrified, to communicate that you're terrified, to sit with that fear and explore it, because loss is frightening. It's uncharted territory that you're exploring, often by yourself, and though it's hard and uncomfortable and spiky and raw, through it is hope and promise and rebuilding. It's okay to focus on it. It's okay to feel bad, but it's also okay to ask for help and to start feeling better about it. You don't have to continue to feel bad for the loss to have meant something. Ultimately, if you let it, loss can be your superpower. Your empathy making, self loving journey to a comfortable life. I believe it because I've lived it, and I know you can too.